Welcome to the fourth of our Data Science for Society seminar. There are some pings in the background. Hopefully they'll stop. It's just that a lot of people are joining in. Wait, maybe I can just say it mustn't tell us. Okay, I'll figure out that later. Yeah, as I said, this is the Data Science for Society seminar series that we run in the second half of every year as part of the Data Science for Social Impact Research Group at the University of Pretoria. We don't do science in a vacuum. We work with many people in our spaces, and especially for me, doing the art of data science means thinking about people. And that's why we have this session. It's not, we all, I think for a lot of us on this call, we do a lot of technical work. But we also have to have these conversations about actually how do we bring society to front and center of the work that we do on there, like, you know, in our areas. This session is also co-hosted with the Masakhane Natural Language Processing Community, and we are also sponsored generously in terms of the Zoom call by Koimas at Wits University. So I'll just let Jade introduce the Masakhane community before then I introduce Timnit.
Thank you, Vikosi. It's always funny when Vikosi introduces someone else to introduce the Masakhane community, because he is also a very key component of the community. So Masakhane are a grassroots community, kind of centering around the use of African languages in natural language processing. So our goal is to kind of spur these technologies and kind of ensure that they are owned by Africans, that they're, you know, representing our communities, that they're serving our communities towards like a future of like well-being and dignity. And so we've got a number of people on the call today joining from the community. I think majority of the attendees are from Masakhane to have this great discussion with Timnit. So thank you so much for joining us, Timnit.
Thank you. I love this community, as you know.
Yes. So Timnit, like some people might say, needs not much of an introduction, but like reading her new bio, as me and my wife and I were discussing it last week after you sent it. So Timnit was fired by Google in December 2020 for raising issues about discrimination in the workplace. Prior to that, she was co-lead of the ethical AI team, research team at Google. She received a PhD from Stanford and did a postdoc at MSR in New York. And now I'm actually remembering I visited Timnit when she was in New York back in the day. And as I guess building up to really connecting with the Black in AI community as well, in the Faith, Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics in AI group, where she studied algorithmic bias and the ethical implications of underlying projects aiming to gain insights from data. Timnit also co-founded Black in AI, a nonprofit that works to increase presence, inclusion, visibility, and health of Black people in the field of AI. Currently, she's setting up an independent AI research institute. And I think in this case, whether it's Masakhane, it's the Data Science Africa community, it's the Deep Learning Endowment community. For us, these are all sister and brother organizations that work together really to build up a lot of what Africans in the diaspora are doing in AI. So, yep, over to you, Timnit, and look forward to the talk.
Thank you. I'm trying to remember which year was Indaba in Stellenbosch. It was 2018, right?
2018, yes.
Yeah. That's when like we had a panel that's really early in the morning, and I was kind of couldn't stop dancing to a South African house, and everybody was like worried, how's she gonna get up early in the morning? It's so much fun.
That was a good party.
Yeah, we're gonna have Timnit's talk, do a Q&A for that talk, and then have a discussion really about shaping these technologies for Africans. So yeah. Okay, now officially hand it over to Timnit.
All right, thank you. Good to see everybody virtually. I kind of miss having these gatherings in person, and I hope at some point we can do that again. And I thank you for inviting me. And I can't tell you how much I love the Masakhane community. I think what you're doing is super amazing. So anyways, okay, I'm gonna share my screen to have this this talk. Okay, so today I wanted to give this short talk about talking about this last paper that I wrote before I got fired from Google, but not all components of this paper, just one component that I wanted to talk about today. So this paper on the dangers of stochastic parrots was written by 7 of us, I guess, but these people, 4 people were not allowed to have their names on the paper. So now it's just 3 of us who have our names, Emily, me, and Angelina Macmillan Major. So I don't think I need to go through this for this community, but just large language models are a type of language technology that are trained on lots and lots of data, and they are generally trained on, people try to train them on like all of the internet, for example, and they're used there as a backbone in a lot of different technology like machine translation or search or auto completion or question answering, just any kind of task that I can think of. I think that language technology is used as a backbone. For example, toxicity detection, hate speech detection, that kind of stuff. Okay, so in this paper, to give you a little bit of a background why I wanted to write this paper, when I was at Google, OpenAI had just come up with GPT-3, and people at Google were just very sad that they weren't, quote unquote, leading the large language model. They weren't leaders in large language models. So they kept on being like, oh, how do we build giant models? Like, what are things we need to build giant models? Why are we not the ones leading in large language models? Jeff Dean in particular was just constantly saying that. And I was constantly trying to send emails being like, well, you should also think about the implications. Why are we racing to, why is size the thing that we're concerned about? Why are we racing to have larger language models? And finally, I thought it would be good to write a paper. Anyhow, so in this paper, we talk about what are some of the dangers of large language models. So we have a whole bunch of things we talk about. One of them is environmental and financial costs. So we talk about environmental racism. The reason we talk about the environmental racism is because the data centers are costly environmentally. And so this was a point that people at Google actually really did not like when we made in the paper, but because they're like, oh, well, our data centers are carbon neutral, but that doesn't mean, that's still consuming resources, right? You're still cutting trees. So for example, I was reading, we have some stats in our paper about like the millions of trees that are cut to create, wind farm or other types of energy. So just, it doesn't mean that you can just use unlimited amounts of energy, even if it's carbon neutral. And furthermore, the thing we talk about is the fact that the people who pay the cost in terms of the environment are not the people who benefit from the language technology, right? So the languages that are supported and amplified by language technology are not those of the people who are not privileged. They're those of the people in dominant groups. And so when we talk about the environment and the financial costs, those are not the people who pay the most cost, but those are the people who have the most benefit. So that's more what I'm going to talk about today. So, and some other stuff we talked about is the fact that as some language technology is generally designed to benefit marginalized communities. So I'll give an example at the end. Most language technology is built to serve the needs of those who already have the most privilege in society. So, so we had about 6 sections in our paper. The first one was environmental racism. The second one, the longest one, was on training data. These large language models are entering basically all other domains that we're seeing now in this space that aims to have lots and lots of scale, right? That aims to train the models with ever and ever larger training data. So in this case, they use, like I said, basically the corpus is, they try to make it all of the internet. But there is this assumption in a lot of these large language model papers that because they're using all of the internet, that it somehow encodes diverse views, which is not true. So that's, we spent a whole time, a bunch of time talking about that. For one, I mean, I don't have to tell this crowd that there are many people who are not on the internet, so their voices are not represented. And even the platforms that they use on the internet, the moderation practices make it such that a lot of people are left out, and some dominant views are the ones that are encoded in this training data. And so we advocate for curation, documentation, and accountability, because if you don't have any documentation, or you don't have any accountability, you can't say where the data came from, then there's no accountability. I can't go and say, hey, you have to remove this thing, or this thing there's a problem here. So we talk a lot about curation, documentation. And of course, because of all of the ways in which the internet works and who's represented in these moderating practices, there's a lot of different types of bias that are encoded in these large language models. So for example, we talk about how size doesn't guarantee diversity, right? And here is an excerpt from our paper. We say, while user-generated content sites like Reddit, Twitter, and Wikipedia, so a lot of the large language models use these as training data, present themselves as open and accessible to anyone, there are structural factors, including moderation practices, which make them less welcoming to marginalized populations. This is the part I'm going to spend a lot more time on today. So we say the net results is that a limited, yes?
I was going to say also, I know just on an assumption there. So we have a more broader view. We do have a lot of Masakhane community, but then we also have people from a more broader data science background.
Oh,
also.
okay.
Yeah, on here. And also I think I've seen some colleagues from philosophy.
Oh, okay.
Just FYI.
Okay, good. Okay. I mean, I did say a bit about large language models. So if people want me to explain more about large language models, please please let me know if there are people if you want me to go over that more. But that's a very good that's good to know. Thank you. I'm not going to cover anything super cryptic or anything. I think this is going to be pretty general points for all of us. So we say that a net result is that a limited set of subpopulations can continue to easily add data, sharing their thoughts and developing platforms that are inclusive of their worldviews. This systemic pattern in turn worsens diversity and inclusion within the internet-based communication, creating a feedback loop that lessens the impact of data from underrepresented populations. So we're still talking about the training data. And so we say as people in positions of privilege tend to be overrepresented in training data for large language models, this training data thus includes encoded biases many recognize as harmful. And in addition to abusive language and hate speech, there are subtler forms of negativity and various social political framing biases that are prevalent in language data. So I want to spend the rest of the time kind of going through a few examples of these 3 points. One is who benefits from large language models and who pays the cost. And a big portion of what I want to spend my time on is the platforms used for training data for these large language models. And then, talk a bit about the encoded bias. So on December 2nd, that's kind of, when I got fired, I was, oops, sorry, I kind of want to, I was taking a break from driving across the country. I was on vacation. And one of the things I was really stressed out about was about escalating war in Ethiopia. And this war is still raging. It is the worst it's the worst thing I've ever seen in my lifetime. a lot of people are dying. A lot of people are trying to escape and be refugees, and even they're suffering, and millions of people are at the brink of starvation. It truly is horrible right now. But so the war started on, and so the bulk of the war is in the Tigray region, which is it's shown here in yellow. And so I was born and raised in Addis Ababa here, that you can see in Ethiopia, in the middle of Ethiopia, the capital city of Ethiopia, and I'm of Eritrean descent. So Eritrea is a country to the north of Ethiopia that got its independence in 1991. And so let's look at, who benefits from large language models and who pays the cost. Ethiopia has a population of 110 million people, and they're, people who speak 86 languages. And if you look at Google Translate, for example, there's 2 Ethiopian languages that are supported, Amharic and Somali. No Afan Oromo, which is spoken by more than 50 million people, also in Kenya, but Oromos are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. Tigrinya, it's spoken by more than 10 million people in Ethiopia and Eritrea, particularly in the north, in their northern region of Ethiopia and many regions of Eritrea, and that's not supported. So the war was declared on November 3rd, and so let's look at the platforms used for training data. They were full of misinformation and hate speech, unfettered calls for violence. At the same time, we have the leaders in this in AI, right, and deep learning. So this is Jan LeCun. He is a VP at Facebook. He actually started the Facebook's AI research lab, and he's one of the 3 people who got the Turing Award. So the Turing Award is like the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for computer science, for his role in creating or advancing what we call deep learning, I guess, methodology, and which is mostly what's used in many aspects of AI, if we could call it that, artificial intelligence today. So when you look at the leaders in AI right now, very, very famous leaders, the kinds of things they're saying is this one, right? He says social media would be guilty if it amplified hate speech and calls to violence, which he thinks it doesn't. And it's and he says 94.7% of hate speech is taken down automatically by AI. I mean, we know, at least especially the Masakhane community knows this, right? Because if you don't even have language technology for so many languages, how are you even you gonna take down 94% of hate speech automatically by AI, right? There is an implicit assumption here that he's talking about certain languages and certain populations and not others. And so I was extremely confused by this statement for many reasons. So just to give you an example, just now in September 28th, that is, let's say like last week or the week before, a single Facebook post galvanized people to commit violence against a specific community. And this journalist just wrote about this. And so this is still happening right now, right? I'm giving you an example from last week, because every single day we're hearing the worst kind of news every day. And of course, there's been well-documented role that Facebook played in Myanmar. And so, as we say in our paper, the net result of how these platforms operate is that a limited set of subpopulations can continue to easily add data, share their thoughts, and developing platforms that are inclusive of their worldviews. So many Ethiopian and Eritrean journalists have completely given up on Facebook because too much harassment. They have migrated to Twitter, and Twitter is still very bad. For example, there are fake accounts with again, generative adversarial network generated images. So these images that you see here are not real. There's this guy, he was pretending to be a diplomat, and he would disseminate stuff to millions of people, millions, an account with 1 million followers, or other accounts would disseminate all of the things he's saying. And these are other examples. None of these are actual real images, right? They're fake accounts with fake images, because the fake image generation technology has gotten so good now. You can just generate these very realistic looking images with what we call generative adversarial networks. And a lot of journalists are under siege, you know, and they've never really had a lot of freedom, and now they've been put on lists to be hacked and attacked. Each time they write something or they say something on social media, there's a lot of, like, always a flood of fake accounts or other people, whether it's paid or not, responding and harassing them. There's people with burner accounts that send death threats. Sorry, just drinking water. There is a proliferation of fake news in addition to targeted harassment. So there's a lot of research on headlines on harassment against journalists. So the ethical AI team comes from many different countries, and our paper was written by people from connections to, you know, 4 continents, different demographics, different disciplines. We wanted to take an interdisciplinary, excuse me, we wanted to take an interdisciplinary approach. And so a couple of weeks before I was fired, we hired Mahdi al-Mohamdi, who's Moroccan, currently in Paris, I believe, either in Zurich or in Paris. And he co-founded a media outlet in Morocco before working on his PhD. So he was a journalist, and then he went on to, after that, he went on to do his PhD in computer science and theoretical computer science. And many of his journalist friends were just being harassed, and they're currently jailed. For example, one of them, Omar Radi, was the first person who talked about Pegasus, the Pegasus software from Israel, that is spyware that was used to target so many people, so many dissidents, so many journalists all over the world. I don't know if you've seen that news. There was just news about it about a couple of months ago, maybe, I don't remember. And those who advocate on these journalists' behalf are similarly harassed and intimidated. And one of the ways in which, and Morocco was actually the #1 country, most of the biggest number of people that were found in that list of people targeted by Pegasus was in Morocco. There were many other places, you know, France, Mexico, etc. But Morocco had many names to be targeted. So one of the ways in which people are harassed is through social media platforms. So for example, Mahdi received death threats because of his advocacy for jailed journalists. And so this is an example. It says in the photo, it says, "You cross the lines, your existence ends." And I remember there were many times that people reported this to Twitter, and it said that this did not violate their terms of service. And then I gave a keynote at iClear International Conference on Learning and Representations, where I gave this example, and all of a sudden the next day it was taken down, right? So this is the kind of whack-a-mole that content moderation is going through right now. So if this is what it takes for 1 death threats, how are we supposed to believe they have a handle on anything else? The answer to me is that they don't. So here is an example of, in February 2021, Facebook had this report, right? They have these reports on coordinated inauthentic behavior. So they said, you know, they removed 385 Facebook accounts, 6 pages, 40 Instagram accounts for violating our policy against coordinated inauthentic behavior. This network originated primarily from Morocco, etc. Now, according to a lot of independent researchers who are still haven't disclosed who they are because they're nervous, but they've been doing this research, the accounts actually it's closer to 15,000. So even when Facebook, says they've done all this work, that they've found in authentic activity, blah blah blah, they're like, oh, we took down 385. No, the actual number is it's closer to 15,000, right? So there's all these profiles harassing journalists and engaging, promoting content from the king and head of intelligence, etc. So in terms of these death threats, right, this is an excerpt from our paper. Jones documents multiple cases where people on the receiving end of death threats on Twitter have had their accounts suspended while the accounts issuing the death threats persist. Harassment on Twitter is experienced by a wide range of overlapping groups, including domestic abuse victims, sex workers, trans people, queer people, immigrants, medical patients, neurodivergent people, and visibly or vocally disabled people. So let's go back to this statement, right? 94% of hate speech is taken down automatically by AI. Again, it doesn't make any sense, right? So let me give you another example. Content moderation already has a lot of issues. So here is a short talk by Maliha Ahmed, who used to be a content moderator, and Alex Hanna, who was under me at Google. And so here they it's like a 20-minute talk. They talk about some of the issues with content moderation. But in addition to all of those issues they talk about, these companies are infiltrated by various agents. So for example, here is Twitter's office at the UAE. So Twitter bots have been implicated in crimes such as the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. British newspaper Metro revealed a Saudi journalist had died under torture in his country after Twitter's Dubai office allegedly disclosed his identity to the kingdom's authorities. The journalist allegedly ran a Twitter account which exposed human rights violations by Saudi authorities and royals, according to Metro. He was arrested on March 15, 2018, then died while being tortured in detention. According to Metro's report, the authorities were able to identify him thanks to information allegedly shared by Twitter's Dubai office, which was accused of involvement in spying on the accounts of Saudi dissidents. So this is just one office. So to recap, these platforms, the content that's generated on these platforms that we just talked about, is the training data used for large language models. There's various forms of abusive language, harassment against different groups of people, that's unaddressed, proliferating harmful content, and in return, work on large language models does not focus on any of these countries' languages or people for which these platforms are causing the aforementioned issues. So when I spoke up, so a lot was happening, the war was going on. I was getting fired. I'm trying to deal with, all of being fired and all of that. And so later when I spoke up against the war in Tigray, I was similarly harassed. And I saw the same flood of comments and coordinated accounts and real plus fake plus whatever accounts. And so actually this one is the kind of coordinated harassment I was receiving online after I got fired from Google. There was a lot of fake accounts and real accounts. There was just so much coordination in harassment that I was receiving by various groups of people. But in terms of the war in Tigray, Haben Girma, who's also my friend, she was saying that she's never in her life have so many people attempted to crush her voice. And this is what's happening when she tried to speak up against the war. So this shows how, again, you're discouraged from adding your thoughts and sharing your worldviews in these kinds of platforms because of these moderation practices. And this is an excerpt from our paper. And this systemic pattern in turn worsens diversity and inclusion, like we said, within internet-based communication, creating a feedback loop. So this is the data that's being used to train large language models. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about, the environmental racism part. And so large language models, like I mentioned earlier, consume a lot of resources. And like I mentioned earlier, we can't just ignore that because, the data centers are carbon neutral or whatever. And because we're still cutting trees, we're still consuming resources when we're creating these data centers. On the other hand, climate change, it exacerbates conflict, right? And those who consume the most resources in large language models are really, generally speaking, not the ones who suffer the most due to climate change. And so many parts of Ethiopia, including Tigray, were struggling with the locust invasion that came because of climate change. And Ertra has gotten progressively drier as time goes by. Ertra also has one of the highest migration rates in the world. In 2017, it was second only to Syria in terms of the number of people trying to cross through the Mediterranean. And this current conflict is creating a huge market for human trafficking. And then those who are lucky enough to migrate are met with xenophobia, which is then expressed on social media, which is then once again used to train large language models, continuing the cycle of hate. In terms of human trafficking and some of the things that Eritreans experience while migrating, this is a good documentary by Meron Stefanos, who's a refugee advocate. It's a very sad documentary, but it shows some of the real horrible issues that they face. So on the one hand, Eritreans have used social media to connect with each other, have a different narrative from the 100% state-controlled media, and organize on behalf of their people, right? So this is for example, one paper or work, a thesis about it. This is an example. So like I said, there's a flock of refugees now fleeing, and Libya is a major transit point. And this was very, very recent. A group of refugees in Libya are being harassed. There's a crackdown. A number of people were killed. A number of people were being held in horrible detention conditions. They fled the detention center. Now they're literally sleeping on the streets. They don't have food to eat. There are a lot of coordinated protests right now going on behalf of refugees in Libya. And these are not just Eritrean, they're Sudanese, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Nigerian. There's a lot of refugees in Libya right now that are who are not in a good situation. And this was just like literally, I think this one was from like a couple of days ago too, and they're trying to raise awareness using social media, right? So they can directly connect to us so that we can advocate on their behalf. On the other hand, like there, people have been subjects of harassment and abuse, and people have knowingly spread fake news, disinformation, misinformation, and calls to violence with impunity on social media. So Mahdi says, this is an example of a killer drone, like a drone that they say is one of the first known cases where the drone itself hunted down someone. And what Mahdi is saying is that social media, a lot of this stuff on social media has caused so many deaths. So we shouldn't, forget that. So, when we Karen Howe is a journalist I really like at MIT Tech Review. So she says, when all of these companies, whether it is, Facebook or Microsoft, Google, whatever, OpenAI, they're building these huge models, right? Large language models, whatever. And they're like, hey, if it could, cure cancer, if it could do something really good for the world, then that's fine, right? And what she's saying is, no, they shouldn't be the ones dictating, exclusively deciding what kind of problems this space should work on, and who should benefit from it versus not. And so I wanted to give an example of what I thought was the right way to do this. And this was I read this article on Wired about people in New Zealand, the Maori, who are trying to save their language from big tech. So what they did was they used local radio stations to gather data, speech, to create a speech recognition or some kind of language technology using their language. So they didn't have data, so they asked people to there was like a competition, so they asked people to submit their speech or something, and within I don't know how long, they got a lot of data. And so once they got this data, they were, I guess, contacted by a whole bunch of tech companies, and they rejected, so to asking them to buy their data or license it or whatever, and they rejected it. And then they published their rejection with a video explaining why and the risk in selling their language to an American corporation. So they were saying that, they suppressed our languages and physically beat it out of our grandparents. Now they want to sell our language back to us as a service. So they said, they want to make sure that whoever uses that data, whoever uses that language, that it is kept within the Maori people, and people can make sure that they are then first and foremost the beneficiaries of this technology. On the other hand, I was reading this article about the origins of machine translation, right? Like we all want to expand machine translation to like various other languages. And it reminds me of this article I read that talks about how, the origins of machine translation, Cold War era defense research. And there was a quote in this paper about how we're always talking about language technology in terms where we want to include more people, we want to communicate with more people, but many times it's been used to do the exact opposite. Right now, for example, in the US, it's used to try to surveil potential immigrants or to vet potential immigrants. And one of the quotes that struck me in this paper was that it said the most important thing happening in Silicon Valley right now is not disruption, it's institution building and the consolidation of power on a scale and at a pace that are both probably unprecedented in human history. So I think that it's very important to kind of, I guess this is kind of apt with some of the recent conversations, at least in the US. I think this centralized power needs to be a lot more decentralized, in my view. And so that's it for me. But I based on these things, I had some questions for discussion with this group. If people are up to it. Some of the questions I struggle with many times is how do we make sure we're building technology that benefits our communities rather than just replicating what's being done in Silicon Valley? And secondly is what are some guiding principles that you might have to get to the first question? With that, I can take questions now, and yeah.
Thanks very much, Timnit, on that. I think maybe first we'll go for Q&A on the talk, and then we will come back to then the questions for discussion that you've put up. But yeah, if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and then from there we're just going to try and manage that process. So if you have a question on the presentation, on there, okay, just wait. Okay, Hercules, see you're first on. You can go ahead.
Sorry, Doc. Jade had her hands up first, so I'm just going to follow up from Jade.
I think she was clapping.
Oh.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
no, thanks. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it was really phenomenal. I can't unhide my camera, so unfortunately you can't see my face. But
sorry, let me switch that on. Sorry, it's just for security kind of things. But yeah, you can switch on video.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Okay, thank you so much. One thing that I found really, I mean, in terms of the talk that you gave a lot of incredible context, and myself, I've been following your case online for a while, and it was really encouraging. I actually must admit, from a human-to-human perspective, and I just want to ask you as a fellow researcher, you know, how did you keep yourself motivated through all of the negative things that happened that were thrown your way? And the reason why I'm asking is it's so important, because if you truly work towards something that is valuable, you need to keep consistent. So I just wanted to know what motivates you through it all. Thanks.
When at the time, like for a few months after I got fired, absolutely I was not motivated. I was like literally just trying to get by. I was very nervous. I was just, you know, tired. I was exhausted, but I was very worried about my team in the ethical AI team. So I was that was what motivated me at the time. I was just trying to make sure that they were not next. And, you know, just make sure like what are they going to do? So that was what I was focused on at the time. And I knew that I had to get my story out before Google was, you know, I knew the playbook. That's the thing. They've done it a number of times to other people. So I was literally just thinking about the current, not the future. And then people would ask me like, what are you doing next? I'm like, what do you mean? What am I doing next? I have no idea. I don't have time to think about that right now, you know? And so, so I guess I had to take that time. I really just had to take that time to get to mentally to a place where I could be motivated again, right? And so once I got to that time of being able to be motivated, okay, so then there's a question of what motivates me. Then the idea of being able to create a structure for research that has different incentives than what we're all used to. I think that really motivates me. It's kind of like, you know, seeing many Masakhanes, like that kind of stuff is really what motivates me, right? I know I was asking Jade and Vukosi, I'm like, you guys are doing like 5 people's work right now, you know, how are you doing it? But I think it's, you know, it's energizing to see this kind of grassroots community doing work that you think is beneficial for your community. So for me, not having to be beholden to a company or an academic institution and trying to come up with an incentive structure that's different, being able to define an incentive structure such that I can really work on things that I feel like are beneficial to my community is something that benefits me. And I'm sorry, that motivates me. And I am so worried. But the thing is, like, I don't feel like I have time to basically just think about, oh, what research question am I interested in? Because there are so many issues that I think we're facing. Like we just have this whole social media thing that I just mentioned. You know, that's never my area. I wasn't really studying misinformation and disinformation, etc. But just seeing, you know, how it's affecting the places I care about, the people I care about, and how all the conversations, many of the conversations are completely ignoring these issues that we're talking about. I felt like out of necessity, I have to work on this, right? Out of necessity, because like nobody else is looking into it. I know that like one of the whistleblowers at Facebook is not talking about Ethiopia, but way back, like, you know, when the war started, I was like trying to, you know, email people who work on the misinformation and all of that at Facebook, and like send them links and tell them, you know, I'm really getting worried about this, etc. And still I didn't see, I barely saw any action, you know. And so it's more so like the motivation sometimes becomes more out of necessity, like, well, I'm here, I'm seeing all these things, what can I do given the skills that I have, kind of thing.
Thank you, Timnit, for that. Colin, next.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question was about sort of being still within the system, right? Because you're no longer beholden to those concerns, and you don't have to account to, like, you know, a corporation or something. Whereas I personally, sometimes I do struggle like with that question of like, how do you work within there and balance those concerns, like providing value to, you know, my employer, but also not losing my soul, you know? So
Well,
what do you think, I suppose?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's where I was for a long time, right? So so even in academia, you have that kind of like, even if it's not an industry, right, there are a set of incentive structures. You have to, I don't know, like publish this many papers, or otherwise you're not doing research, or, you know, caring about students is not really the thing that's most valued, or I don't know, you know what I mean? So like, so sometimes I was trying to figure out, okay, like, how do I convince them that this thing is important for them too? Like, it lies in their incentive structure. So for example, when we were at Google, there were so many things. One was the kinds of work that people were doing that they wanted to squash, like they did with me, right? So we were trying to shield people from that kind of action. Two was, you know, how do we make sure people are rewarded for their work, but without having to change, you know, like what their work is. And so we had to come up, like, for example, we had to know what they were looking for. At Google, for example, when you're being evaluated, they have stuff about like difficulty. They have these three mediums: difficulty, impact, and wow, I forgot the third one. leadership, difficulty, and impact. So me and Meg Mitchell, my co-lead at the time, we would practice, we had like, we figured out how to make our team's work legible in that sense, because otherwise then people wouldn't be, you know, they'd be doing all this work. They're doing all this work in research. They're doing all this work in mentorship. And so we wanted them to be, you know, to be rewarded for this work. So we had to do that. Like, so basically take our work and figure out how to make it legible to whatever system. And I think whatever system you're in, you still have to do that, right? So for example, if I get my funding from foundations, I have to do my work and make the work legible to them, right? And I don't want to lose my soul in that process. Like, I don't want to just only cater to the people who are funding me or something like that, right? Which is making me think about diversifying my my funding right now. But anyways, that's a different conversation to have. But I think anytime you do this kind of thing, you have to make it legible to the whatever community is going to fund you or judge your work. And I think that's a skill you have to think about regardless of what system you're in. And when I was a PhD student, one thing I did, I was telling students, I was like, you know, I would do the mainstream thing, that I would do the thing that I know that it's going to count, whatever, it's fine, even though it's, you know, I might not be that interested in whatever. And then I would do the thing that I think is important. But even if it doesn't work out, like, it's fine. It's not you know, on the line of me getting a PhD. So when I was working with Joy, I worked with her, advising her on her master's thesis. I didn't tell anybody. I was a PhD student. She was a master's student. I didn't tell anyone. They didn't understand. When I try to tell people, they didn't understand why I was doing this. What that ended up being my main work later, basically that line of work. But when I was doing a PhD, I was just doing it on the side. I wasn't, you know, it wasn't the thing that was going to make or break my PhD. Secondly, I didn't even know if we could publish it. So but then there was a community of people who created a new conference. a new venue for work like ours, right? And I helped do that with them too. So what I mean is that, you know, I would think, okay, what's the incentive structure?
Mm-hmm.
If the incentive structure doesn't allow you to do this work, how can you change, you know, how can you slightly change the incentive structure? What can you do within the incentive structure, and how can you change the incentive structure if you can't do this, right? For in our case, publishing is still important, but we needed to create a whole new conference where we can publish work, right? And for that, we needed to have a coalition. So those are the kinds of steps I would think about, right? Like, what can I do within this incentive structure? What can I do outside of it? How do I build a coalition to allow me to do these things? And, you know, I think it's all about incentive structures, honestly. So that's the thing that I would just think about. But yeah, I think you can still do a lot within the system. You know, I think every system is flawed, and you can still, you know, there are workers are organizing right now, they're whistleblowing, they're doing all sorts of things from within the system. So I think if people build a coalition, they can still do a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks on that. Assad, you can go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the talk. Really glad to have been had the opportunity to listen to it, and a lot of very concerning things. But I'd like to say, so I'm sort of new to the field of NLP, and I'm very interested in what it's very concerning, the direction that the field is taking with these large language models, particularly, and this is the focus of all these big tech. So I just like to get your views on and like, maybe it's very concerning that it isn't the direction that the field would go in reality. But if you were to talk about what guidelines, sort of also what would you give to new researchers on how to do responsible machine learning language, because new researchers coming to the field the immediate thoughts are to start using these transformers and using these as baselines. So I just wanted to like sort of get your views on what are your perceptions of what would be a good direction, or how would you like to see the field of NLP taking? And like I know things like Masakhane and sort of specialist models would be very useful. But yeah, and also how can we as an individual researcher sort of like turn the tide in a field that's very much heading in this direction, which everybody is just trying to like sort of create the biggest transformer or whatever the case is. Yeah, thanks for that.
You know, let me give you some background. I'm not even in NLP or linguistics or anything, right? So what happened when I was writing this paper is that I saw this drive like larger, we need to do larger. And then I emailed Emily M. Bender, who's my first co-author. And I was like, hey, do you have any do you know of any papers I can send these people? Like, they're talking about this stuff. I want to send, you know, some references and things like that. And she's like, no. I'm like, okay, well, I've been sending them your tweets. So, I mean, if you can write something like a paper, then I can send them a paper instead. So just FYI, like if you're interested in writing a paper, I want to send, you know, I would be interested in your views on this. And then she was like, hey, do you want to write one together? And I was like, oh, okay, you know, and so we pulled in people and we wrote this thing. But the reason I wanted to do that is because I guess it shows a little bit about what direction I think we should go in. And so I want to bring in the linguists, the sociolinguists, the cultural linguists, because they they've been studying this kind of language for a long time. They've been studying the effects of language, the power dynamics, culture, etc. So the direction I'd like to take this in is literally bring in linguists and other people and take. So one direction that I saw that was great was this thing that we saw with the Maori. That was the way I gave that example, right? I love that. I was like, it was this community that wanted to work on language technology for themselves. They created this data set, they did it in a way that's great, and they're guarding the data set, and they're trying to figure out how to make sure to work on the technology in a way that benefits their communities. So that's what I would like to see. And I'd like to see more research on just like, we co-organized this workshop, right, with Vukosi about practical machine learning for developing countries, right? Or like work on lower resources, small language, like low compute. Small data, low compute. Like that's the kind of research I'd like to see, rather than, how can we, push the limits of just like, excuse me, make it larger and larger. And so I guess my thoughts on the direction are more like, who should be at the table, right? Like, who should we bring in? And I think that linguists are so much more thoughtful on this kind of stuff, that they should really be at the forefront of some of this work. Sorry.
Okay, we'll have Emma next, and then yeah.
Hi, I want to, okay, sorry, I can't start my video, but that's okay. Thank you so much, Timnit. I am in.
You can start your video now, Emma.
Okay, thanks. I am in a bit of a rush because I'm actually rushing to a COMEST meeting on policy making. Question has to do with policy making, and I'm I really enjoyed everything that you said, and I'm one of the philosophers in the house.
Oh, excellent.
Could really follow you. I just want to so I'm working on a big project on what I call, I'm a philosopher, so I use words like infuse, but I'm working on a project on the value infusedness of AI technologies. And what I mean with that is simply that if we think of all the very nice projects at the moment, in terms of value by design, and focusing on how important it is to have ethics through all the stages of the life cycle of an AI system and all of those things, it sketches such a kind of pure picture, which is just as, unfortunately, I'm afraid from a philosopher's point of view, as empty as the abstract principles that we have in our policies. It's just as inactionable because it's either too strict, or it is either too loose. So it just leads to ethics washing and, having everything looks fantastic. But what we should take into account is the value ladenness of this process. Who takes the decisions during the design? So the values that we work with when we talk about ethics in the context of AI is never pure. We have to ask whose values. We have
Absolutely.
to understand, and you know what, I can tell you now, and I've really worked very hard on various projects for UNESCO and whatever, it's all completely useless, because if we do not understand that we are working with something that keeps on warping. So, and I just wondered if you, but I'm glad to see that you're, it looks as if you agree, but that's something for me that I think we're just completely misguided in what we're trying to do.
Yeah, so I just sent you, I just had this, I'm gonna do this again, this paper that analyzes papers in machine learning, and it tries to encode some of the values in these papers. So one of the things, like, just to show you how you're here and the machine learning community is like here, is that they don't even to get people in this community to know that you are encoding certain values is like that already. That step is not we're not there, right?
No.
So the first step for me has always been, look, one of the things we need to do is make sure we know all of these things are value laden. There's also another paper, I forgot what it's called. It's like paper on health equity and it talks about how everything is value laden. They talk about the metrics that people use, whether it's ratios or differences or, you know, various different things. And they kind of give case studies about how these are value laden, what kind of decisions you're making just by you know, picking simple things, you know, using absolute value versus not, something like that. And what I wanted to do, and so one of the values I think that is completely unquestioned in this space is scale. Scale is always good, and but people don't even think this is an assumption that is put by the community. I think that if we can keep talking more about these values and show that not everybody has the same values, and you can come. There's someone behind you trying to see if it's okay. I think it's fine.
No, it's my son. Sorry, but
no, it's fine. I do this all the time too. I'm like, I don't want to be on camera, but I personally think that if we could actually show some of these tenets that people think are just unquestioned, and that these are unquestioned value laden tenets, and that different communities have different values, or even 2-3 communities, and you can show them mismatch. Look, this is the value encoded in creating large language models. This is the value that we can analyze, that we see infused in it. This is the value of some other community. Look at how, you know, these values are not here, or whatever. These values are not considered good for them. You know, I think that that kind of exercise would be helpful. But honestly, I think that a lot of the movement, this might be a little bit tangential to what you're saying, but when I'm looking at, I spend a bunch of time trying to do various things. One is to convince my own community to do something differently. One is to work with other people who have already, you know, who already think that things should be done differently to push some change. And to a certain extent, so I think the machine learning community is doing something different. They're starting to institute ethics reviews, etc. But the worst offender is the computer vision community. Face recognition, surveillance, all of that, that's from the computer vision community. And that community is not even like, it's very far from doing anything. So I think that what I've found more success in is working with the people who already were advocating for change. So they were communities who already were fighting surveillance, right? So then my research could be used by those communities to then make change, and then the research community has no, option but to change. So I think that analyzing these values would really help. Like if we can then make an argument and say, look at your values. These are also the values of profit-driven capitalism. I don't know, but these are not the values of a lot of these communities. I think that would actually be super helpful. But I also think there are some very clear things that go wrong, where we don't need to do all of those kind of types of exercises to say this is wrong and this needs to be regulated, right? Like, so when I was showing the calls for violence and how they actually enact real violence or something like that, I think I think those kinds of things are pretty clear. It is just having the will to actually do something about it.
Thank you so much. Because I'm going to take a chance and just make one follow-up comment because I have to run. But I just want to say also, I think I'm trying also to find a way to show that those values are impacted on by the technology itself. So those values are not, value of scale. That is not a neutral value. The technology is not neutral. None of these values are neutral. And so there's a kind of a feedback loop in terms of ethics, but I'm not sure if I've lost my connection.
I can hear you. You said there's a feedback loop in ethics. I think that was the last comment maybe she made.
Yeah, I think her connection was a bit bad on that part. Yeah. Okay, I'll ask you maybe to type it off, and then we can have a thing. I just want to give, I think Sharif and Yassine and Mohammed have been waiting, and there's a few questions via the chat on that part. But Sharif, I'll ask you to unmute.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm also unable to turn on my video, but that's fine.
Yeah, okay, wait. You can turn your video now.
Awesome. Thank you. I just want to first say thank you for this amazing talk, that I'm really glad I was here today to hear all the wisdom you have to share with this great community. I have a two-sided question, twofold question. The first one is really, what is the role of the youth in all this? In the sense that we have amazing people like you, like Dr. Bukosi, serving as anchors for us, people we can look up to and see all the great things you're doing. We want to aspire to do like you, or even better than you. You know, that's the goal. But then we see how the system, as you're trying to do all this good work, the system is letting you down and all that stuff. So we as young people, how do we navigate this territory? Like, what do we do? Do we not follow the same path you did? Do we do something else? That's my first question. And the second question is, we have all these great talks that we do, but what is a great template? You know, for someone like me, again, who is very young in this field, is there a social media platform I can look at right now and be like, oh, this incorporates everything that Dr. Gebru was trying to tell us. Like, this is a good model, let's go with this. Or like an amazing NLP application or development that I can look up to and be like, okay, this is great. This is a good model to follow. Those are my questions, and I would really appreciate you.
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of the first one, what's the role of the youth? I think the youth are doing a lot. And so actually I tell people to follow them many times. So for example, when I got fired, a lot of people in various universities organized this No Tech for, there's an organization they started called No Tech for Tyrants. And so they had this campaign called Google Recruit Me Not. So this No Tech for Tyrants group was trying to get students to understand what are all the different companies and places that they could work at. Like, they were trying to have a list of places that people can work at that don't have these issues. And, you know, they were just having a movement to say no, like to use their agency. And I think that's a big deal, because that's how change is made. You know, it doesn't happen overnight. I think that as that happens, I'm hoping that there will be more and more, you know, smaller companies, more independent research institutions. Maybe people will rethink, academics will rethink their affiliations with all of these larger companies. I think that regulation is coming. So I really do think that at some point we're honestly going to see antitrust and, you know, breaking up of some of these companies and stuff like that. So you know, I think that, like, you could think about, okay, if you're in the system, quote unquote, you know, again, like, people are building coalitions at work, right? So how do you join one of these coalitions? At Google, they had just started a union. So you can just not, you know, silently work on, you know, tech for apartheid or something, you know, like right now there's a No Tech for Apartheid petition campaign going on with Jewish Voice for Peace. But like that's what I mean, right? Because Google has this and a number, Google and Amazon have these partnerships with the Israeli military. And so there's a campaign going on right now to stop that. So if you're in one of these places, companies, you can join some of those campaigns, right? And say, what is the thing I'm building being used for? And how can I make sure that it's not being used for things that I don't, you know, I'm not, I don't approve of, and how do I myself think about my ethics? Where is the line, you know, of what I'm willing to do versus not, and how can I encourage my academic institution or government or whatever to have more independent, things going on, more development of technology that is specifically benefiting my community rather than these large multinational corporations. So I would say building a coalition is important because even though, yeah, they did this to me, I could have emerged a lot worse if I did not have a coalition, right? If there weren't people in, the deep learning, DABA, data science, Africa, Black and AI, et cetera, like all of these people supporting me, they could have done a lot worse. So I think that's what I'm saying. It's really important to build that coalition. In terms of a positive model for things, that's sort of what I want to do in my new research institute. But I think Masakhane is a great example. It's a grassroots, kind of community that's trying to work on African languages and is being very intentional and thinking about, why we're doing what are we doing and why are we doing this. That's a good example. There's people working on, I think, open source like standardizations or something for social media, but I don't really know much about it. For me, it's more like some technology, there just needs to be, what I want to do is I want to force them to have to put resources in order to either do more content moderation or something, or like have more regulation or something like that, right? So to give you an example, I co-wrote this paper that showed that the error rates on these automatic face recognition systems, the error rates on darker skinned people, especially darker skinned women, were much higher than those of lighter skinned men. I didn't have an answer at the time as to like what should be done, right? But there were a lot of people who had been working on anti-surveillance technology, et cetera, for a while. And so at some point, a bunch of bans, there were bans that were passed by, especially using it by law enforcement, was banned in San Francisco. It was banned in different cities, and it's been sort of spreading because it's infringing on people's human rights. So that's just an example. Like sometimes the technology just shouldn't. I can't think of a good use of it. So the example is how to decide that it's not good for us and we ban it, and then some other times we build it in a way that we think supports us. So that Maori example that I gave was kind of an example of that. I suggest also Emily Bender has this a syllabus for an NLP and society or something, the impact of NLP on society. If you go to her website, Emily Bender. And so I can, I think I recommend like following along that class too, or the readings in that class, to have a positive way of how to, analyze the impacts of technology.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, the last question is going to be from Yassine before we get to the conversation. And Yassine, you should be able to switch on your video.
Oh, is it Yassine at Huggy Face?
Yes. Hi.
Hey, Meg talked to me about you. Yeah. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thanks a lot for the talk. I wanted to go back to one of the points that you made earlier about bringing people from other disciplines and working with people with other disciplines. And one of the difficulties there I found is that some of the disciplines we want to work with have the same issues that we have in terms of who gets upholded, who gets like to have a voice there. Which means that a lot of the time, like you'll have to do some of the work of diving into the discipline to understand how that relates to the work. And you've been very successful at navigating that. So I wondered if you had any specific pointers about.
So you're saying that some of the disciplines that we want to work with have the same issues that only the privileged people get to do, and they're oppressed. Yeah. I mean, which discipline does not have that? That's just like, yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. And it's still, so I've worked with people, many other a bunch of different other disciplines. And you're right, I've seen this problem. I think so two things. I've found that some people in these disciplines have like they've studied this problem. So for example, Ali Al-Khatib has this blog post on anthropological HAI. So he used to be an anthropologist, and he writes about how there were conversations about anthropology and how it was used, and like there's all of these issues that with how it was a medium for colonization, all of that, and there's all these writings about it. And so he writes about how we as people in computer science can learn from that. So I mean, so even if, and same with archives, like I wrote a paper with an archivist, with a historian. She's Korean, but she also pointed me to works and other movements, counter movements and counter movements. So we talk about, so for example, one example I can give is, right, the archivist was the same kind of issue. It's like, who gets to collect whose data and how do they portray people, right? And so many people in indigenous communities were not, did not want to be, the collected, like basically. And so they came up with their own platforms. Like there's one called Mukurtu, Mukurtu. So, so I guess, what I'm trying to say is that they have the same issues, but because they're older, they've also had conversations. There's still issues, but we can kind of learn from what those conversations looked like and what the counter movements looked like. And then we can go try to find those people in the counter movements, right? But, you see it at Stanford. They're starting to teach this ethics class, and it's 3 white guys, okay, teaching ethics and computer science. Sure, they're all from different disciplines, excellent, but it's still 3 white guys teaching ethics and computer science, right? And I'm just like, really, this is the point we were trying to make, right? And so, yeah, I agree. I mean, this is still a problem, and so we have to. It's not enough to just bring in different disciplines, right? We still have to pay attention to all the different dimensions of privilege and oppression. And so I think for me, I just try to. Oh, I'm looking at cringes in South African. But the way I try to find people for me is, be in different communities like this one, let's say, pay attention to, for example, in the US, Nikki Washington has a class specifically on surveillance and tech, and that's a Black woman. Or I pay attention to people, I try to also connect with people in Brazil and people, across the continent, across the African continent, etc. So you still have to do the extra work to make sure that you are connecting with people whose voices might not be heard, who are not getting cited, etc. It doesn't mean, I agree with you, it doesn't mean that just because we're going to a different discipline, like, that now everything is solved. But we can still learn a lot from that struggle that different discipline has had, is my point of view.